My purity, my pride for God's glory. Grace was 7 when she knelt beside her grandmother's bed and gave her heart to Jesus. Stars twinkled through the window as her grandmother's hands held hers gently. They prayed together, and Grace felt something warm fill her chest. She knew God loved her, and she loved Him with all her heart. From that day, Grace carried a small Bible everywhere. She read stories of brave women like Esther and Ruth. Her friends thought she was different, but Grace didn't mind. She had found something precious that made her complete, and she wasn't going to let it go for anything. At 15, Grace watched classmates pursue empty relationships, giving pieces of themselves away easily. They searched for love in places that could never satisfy. Grace felt pressure to join them, but prayer reminded her she was set apart for something greater. After being mocked at school, Grace cried out to God. Tears rolled down as she read about being in the world but not of it. Peace washed over her, and she made a covenant with God, promising to keep herself pure in body, mind, and spirit for His glory alone. College brought new challenges. Her roommate couldn't understand Grace's choices. Grace felt isolated on Friday nights while others sought temporary pleasures. But in quiet moments, she discovered deeper intimacy with God through prayer and worship that filled her soul with joy. Grace joined Christian women who met for Bible study. These sisters became her fortress, reminding her she wasn't alone. They prayed together and held each other accountable. Grace learned purity meant saying yes to God's best, trusting His plans were greater than anything she imagined. At 23, Grace met David at a church conference. He seemed to share her faith, and they began dating. For the first time, Grace felt powerful physical attraction. David respected her boundaries initially, but soon pressured her to compromise, saying times had changed. Grace's heart was torn. She spent sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. One morning, she prayed for clarity. The answer came that true love would never ask her to betray her convictions. With trembling hands but unwavering faith, Grace ended the relationship, choosing God's approval. The months after were dark. Grace questioned her choice, whether she was strict. Friends said no man would wait. The enemy whispered lies that she would end up alone, that her purity was worthless in this world. But Grace recognized God's voice. She dove deeper into prayer, fasting, and studying Scripture with renewed hunger. She discovered her purity honored God with her body as a living temple and demonstrated His ways were worth more than the world's approval. Years passed, and Grace built a beautiful life serving God. She mentored young girls, encouraging them to value themselves as God's precious daughters. She watched friends struggle with broken relationships. Her life stood as quiet testimony that God's way led to peace and wholeness. Grace learned purity brought unexpected blessings. She had clarity to pursue dreams, emotional energy for meaningful friendships, and spiritual sensitivity to hear God's voice. Her joy depended on her connection with Jesus. She became a woman of prayer, interceding and seeing God move powerfully. On her 30th birthday, Grace reflected on her journey. Society said she should worry about being unmarried, that her clock was ticking. But she saw God's faithfulness, protection, and provision. Every no to worldly compromise had been yes to God's greater plan, and she regretted nothing. A letter arrived from Sarah, someone Grace had mentored. Sarah wrote how Grace's example saved her from devastating mistakes, how she chose purity after witnessing Grace's unwavering faith. Grace realized her life had become a living epistle for those watching to see if God's promises were true. Grace shared her testimony at church. She spoke honestly about struggles, loneliness, and victories. She talked about nights she cried, relationships she walked away from, and times she felt misunderstood. But she also spoke about God's supernatural comfort and deep satisfaction of honoring Him. Young women flooded the altar, weeping and recommitting to purity. Some confessed past mistakes and found healing, while others made first commitments. Grace prayed over each one, speaking life and encouragement, reminding them it was never too late. That day marked revival among the women in her church. At 32, Grace met Michael on a mission trip. He had also chosen to honor God with purity, understood the value of waiting, and pursued God with the same passion Grace did. Their relationship was different from anything Grace had experienced, built on prayer, mutual respect, and shared purpose for God's kingdom. When Michael proposed, he said her faithfulness to God attracted him most. Her purity reflected the bride of Christ, and he felt honored to receive such a gift. Grace wept tears of joy because God had been faithful to His promises. Everything she waited for, every sacrifice, every lonely night now made perfect sense. On her wedding day, Grace wore white with a grateful heart. Walking down the aisle, she thought about the 7-year-old girl who knelt beside her grandmother, the teenager who stood alone, and the woman who trusted God when the path seemed impossibly difficult. Her purity had been her pride, not in arrogance, but in humble confidence. That night, Grace and Michael prayed as husband and wife, thanking God for keeping them. Grace realized her story wasn't about waiting for a husband, but discovering that a life surrendered to God brings fulfillment beyond understanding. Her purity had brought God glory, transformed lives, and demonstrated His ancient truths still held power. She had chosen the narrow path, and it led to abundant life, proving what we sacrifice for God, He returns pressed down and running over with His endless love and faithfulness.